Welcome to this HP Technical Configuration Guide. In this TCG, we're discussing multiple spanning tree with an emphasis on interoperability between HP Comware switches and Cisco switches. We'll be looking at the configuration steps for configuring both Cisco and HP Comware switches in a single MSTP region. Here's our sample topology. We have two core switches, one of which is an HP Comware switch and one a Cisco switch. We have two access switches, one being Comware and one being Cisco. In this topology, the management VLAN is VLAN 1. Comware 1 is going to be configured as the root for spanning tree instance 1, which has VLANs 1, 3, and 5 mapped to it. And Cisco 1 is going to be the root for instance 2, which has VLANs 2 and 4 mapped to it. Comware 1 will also be the root for instance 0, which has all the other VLANs mapped to it. So the idea is users on Comware 2 in VLANs 2 and 3 will have traffic sent across both uplinks. So VLAN 3 traffic will use this uplink, VLAN 2 traffic will use this uplink. Something similar will take place on the Cisco switch with VLANs 4 and 5. So VLAN 5 traffic will go to the Comware switch, VLAN 4 traffic will go to the Cisco switch. So this will allow for load sharing of traffic using both uplinks. And once again, this will be configured with multiple spanning tree using three instances, the default instance, instance 1 and instance 2, and the VLANs will be mapped to those instances. The devices used in this topology are two HP 5800 series switches and two Cisco 3750 switches. HP switches are running 5.2.0 version of Comware, and the Cisco switches 12.2 of Cisco iOS. Be aware that spanning tree is not enabled by default on HP Comware switches. Cisco switches run PVST or Rapid PVST by default. When multiple spanning tree is configured, the region name by default is the switch's MAC address. That means that each switch ends up in a different region, and common instance spanning tree is used between the switches. It's important that when you configure multiple spanning tree, that the region name, the revision number, and the instances and VLAN mappings to instances are configured the same. If any of those details are different, the hash value will be different and the switches will end up in different regions. So ensure that the region name, which is case sensitive, the revision number, which is a static value, and the instances and VLAN mappings to instances are the same on all the switches. That will ensure that the switches end up in the same region. Cisco switches run either multiple spanning tree or multiple instance spanning tree. To ensure compliance with the IEEE 802.1s standard, Cisco switches must run these versions of software or later. Earlier versions will implement a pre-standard version of multiple spanning tree that is not compliant with 802.1s. Be careful, the pre-standard and standard commands look the same, so do not use the commands to check support for multiple spanning tree. Another caveat to be aware of is that HP Comware switches do not use the industry standard costs for multiple spanning tree by default. The default cost on an HP Comware switch for a 10 gig link is 2, whereas the industry standard on Cisco and Provision is 2000. So it's recommended that you change the default costs to use the industry standard values by using the command STP path costs standard.1t. Some additional tips when enabling multiple spanning tree on Cisco switches. It's important that multiple spanning tree be enabled first on the eventual CIST route to avoid connectivity disrupting PVST simulation errors. PVST requires that the CIST route, in other words the route for the entire spanning tree, be in multiple spanning tree and not be in PVST. So what you need to do is lower the priority of your core switches and enable multiple spanning tree on those switches first. Be aware that initiating multiple spanning tree on a Cisco switch that's doing inter-VLAN routing will cause the VLAN interfaces to restart. This could take between 5 to 30 seconds depending on timers used. More information about PVST to multiple spanning tree migration is available in the PVST to multiple spanning tree migration TCG. In this video I'm just mentioning some of the guidelines, and because of time we won't go into them in great detail. Configure multiple spanning tree on all switches in your network, but don't change the mode to multiple spanning tree on your Cisco switches or enable spanning tree on your Comware switches until you have a change window. Configure your core switches as multiple spanning tree root switches for all instances, and don't forget about instance 0, and change the STP mode to multiple spanning tree starting with your core switches and then change the mode on other switches. Don't make the mistake of changing the mode on your edge switches first because of the PVST simulation errors. So to enable multiple spanning tree on HP Comware switches, do the following. Type System View to go to System View. Enable spanning tree. Spanning tree is not enabled by default. Go to the region configuration. Set the region name, the revision level. The revision level is just a static value that you configure. It needs to be the same once again on all devices. Specify your instances. In this case, VLAN 1 and 2 are mapped to instance 1. VLANs 10 to 20 are mapped to instance 2. You can check your configuration before activating it by using the command check region configuration. The configuration is not activated until you type the command active region configuration. That command needs to be typed, otherwise the configuration is not used by the switch. Type quit to go back to System View, and then you can specify the priorities of your switches by either using the command STP instance, the instance number, in this case instance 1, and specifying that this switch is the primary route or the secondary route, or otherwise by manually specifying priorities. The lower the priority, the more likelihood of the switch becoming the root. To ensure industry standard interoperability, on Comware switches you need to type the command STP path cost standard.1t. In other words, the Comware switches will use the industry standard costs. And on interfaces connected to the Cisco switches, such as interface gigabit 101, you need to type the command STP compliance.1s. This ensures that industry standard BPDUs are used on those links and not pre-standard BPDUs. To do something similar on Cisco switches, firstly change the spanning tree mode to multiple spanning tree. Then enter multiple spanning tree configuration. Map your VLANs to instances. So in this example, VLAN 1 and VLAN 2 are mapped to instance 1. VLANs 10 to 20 are mapped to instance 2. Specify your region name, in this case HP, and your revision number. This configuration has to be the same on all switches, otherwise they'll end up in different regions. Type exit on Cisco switches to activate the configuration. You can then specify the priorities of the different instances. In this case, this switch has got a priority of 0 for instance 0 and instance 1, but a priority of 4096 for instance 2. It's good practice to split the root roles across your core switches. So the strategy for this implementation is to firstly configure multiple spanning tree on all the switches, but not enable spanning tree on the Comware devices or enable multiple spanning tree on the Cisco devices. We want to ensure once again that the region name, revision level, instances and mappings to instances are the same on all the devices. At the moment, the switches are using the defaults with regards to spanning tree. In other words, the HP switches are not running spanning tree and the Cisco switches are running PVST. They will block ports via PVST. But that's going to change once we enable multiple spanning tree on all the devices. It's important that you ensure that VLAN 1 is permitted on all trunk ports, which it is in our topology. we need to change the priorities of the core switches to prevent PVST simulation errors. Now, we don't have time to go through all the details here. For more migration strategies, please see the PVST to multiple spanning tree TCG. We're going to then configure the HP switches to use compliant costs and compliant BPDUs. And then we're going to enable spanning tree and multiple spanning tree on the core devices first to prevent simulation errors. We'll then enable multiple spanning tree and spanning tree on the edge devices, and then we'll do a check of our topology to ensure that all the devices are in a single region and that the right ports are blocking and forwarding. That concludes this first part, explaining the configuration and best practices of multiple spanning tree on HP Comware and Cisco switches. In the second part, we'll continue the discussion with a practical demonstration of the configuration and testing of spanning tree on both Comware switches and Cisco switches.